So it's been 5 years since violence erupted in Mozambique's northern Cabo Delgado region. Since then, about 1 million people are believed to have been forced to flee their homes, and hundreds and thousands more, in fact, have been killed in the fighting. The conflict in the region was sparked by the discovery of gas reserves in the Rovuma Basin off the coast. Let's talk about the situation 5 years on with Piers, Cabo Delgado Analyst. A very good afternoon to you, Piers. Grateful for your time today. Fighting's been raging in Cabo Delgado since 2017. Close to 1 million people, at least according to the UN, have now been displaced. How has the situation evolved over the course of 5 years?
Well, it's been an insurgency that has developed from a very low-key number of very localized attacks into an insurgency that has affected significant sections of the province, shut down the LNG development, or forced the shutdown of the LNG development, and as we've seen in the last 15 months, an intervention from Rwandan and from SADC troops to try and assist the Mozambicans to contain and to fight back and erode the capacities of an insurgency which still remains very much in play despite some positive developments on the counterinsurgency front.
Well, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees says that the fighting has not subsided. So I wonder how effective the deployment of the likes of these SADC forces and Rwanda's contribution have been.
Well, it's always very difficult to know and to measure deterrence, but there's an uneven footprint in terms of impact on the insurgency itself. So it's a kind of a work in progress, and it's a fairly fluid situation. What we've seen is that in the areas of responsibility that have been primarily given to the Rwandan forces, there's been a very significant increase in the security environment. But many of the insurgent elements which were operating previously in those areas have moved across into areas that are either under the responsibility exclusively of Mozambican forces, or indeed the SADC forces. They've split up into much smaller groups, and they're roaming in a way and resupplying through attacks on vulnerable communities and so forth. So it's difficult to measure exactly the overall scale of the security challenge. It certainly exists. I mean, again, in the last few days, we've had more reports of attacks and beheadings and so forth. It's relatively low-key in that we aren't seeing massive attacks that we saw in some instances previously. But the insurgents have still been able to demonstrate a capacity to attack, particularly Mozambican forces, but also they've ambushed some of the SADC forces as they did a couple of weeks ago. So they do retain a capacity to cause significant damage. Now, of course, the lockdown on hard security issues, this kind of counterinsurgency work needs to be stepped up in order for there to be some basis for a human security approach, which is going to be the longer term building of relations with communities, socioeconomic development, dealing with exclusion and inclusion issues. And that's the much longer term fight which raises concerns about the bandwidth and capacity of the Mozambican government to really deliver on that front and put in place the modalities for a sustainable solution.
On that then, Piers, it has been said often by some analysts such as yourself that until, for example, there's been a split or an equitable sharing of resources that would come from the exploration by the many foreign companies in northern Mozambique, this will simply not come to an end. So when you talk about shoring up, if you will, the response to what's going on, effectively, who would have to lead that? Is it still the Mozambican government, or is there space now for an external actor?
Yeah, well, of course, it must be the Mozambican government that is the primary point actor on these issues. It certainly needs a lot of support. And what we've seen in the last year or so is the development of various development strategies from the government supported by the international community. We've seen the establishment in the last few years of a development agency dedicated to development in the north. We've seen NGOs and others in the international community trying to work with the government. But it's been a somewhat haphazard process, uncoordinated in many respects, fragmented, siloed, and so forth. And so the real challenge of pulling these efforts together into a coordinated strategy is a primary concern that the Mozambican government doesn't have the wherewithal and the bandwidth to be able to lead this charge. So that does remain a significant problem, but and will be for the foreseeable future. But in terms of at least trying to move forward around framing some of the concerns, there's been some progress. There is still a lot of contention over these issues, but we're not looking at any short-term solution to these problems. In terms of foreign companies and the equitable sharing of income and so forth, look, it's still very early days. Income has not been generated from the LNG sector yet. We only saw the floating LNG operations come online a couple of days ago, which is symbolically very significant. But it's going to be some time, maybe some months, before Total in particular reboots its operations in a way which would try and put the production for LNG supplies back online to get some earnings for the Mozambican government in the next few years.
Piers, good to speak to you. I wish we had more time, but for today, thank you very much for your contributions.